There we go. This meeting is being recorded. So again, we're talking about therapeutic disclosure, about sex addiction, infidelity, porn addiction, whatever it is that's happening in a relationship that's causing a lot of problems. So my first question for you, Matt, is why should people do a therapeutic disclosure? What's the whole point?
Scott, I'm gonna have to stop you.
Okay.
I got some new socks for Father's Day.
Oh my God, I forgot Matt's socks. Matt hates wearing shoes, and he loves to wear crazy socks, and I always make him show off his socks.
These, you know what, honestly,
I'm excited about disclosure.
I know, and I'm fine jumping into disclosure, but these socks, to be honest with you, they're not particularly crazy. In fact, when I saw them, I went, oh, those are comfortable. And so I'll show them real quick, and then we'll jump right into disclosure. So
and these are Father's Day socks, so they're special.
These are Father's Day socks. Yeah. So lots of like fun, different colors, and blue, black, purple, green, all sorts of no green, but all sorts of fun, different colors in there. So I just thought I'd show you my fun Father's Day socks. They actually have, and I'm not flexible enough to show you, but like this embroidered dog on the top.
Oh, really?
And I'm like, that is so cool. Like, anyway, so let's jump into disclosure. So what do you got?
Okay. All right. So why should people think about doing therapeutic disclosure? What's the point? What do they get out of it?
Well, so interestingly enough, I remember when I first really started studying relationships and understanding how relationships work, I remember reading something that basically really caused me to pause. What caused me to pause was this idea that lies in a relationship will destroy a relationship faster than any other behavior. So the research, if you will, that I had been reading basically said lying will hurt a relationship more than an affair will hurt a relationship. So assuming that there's an affair and there's honesty around the affair, or at least honesty when being confronted, that essentially lying behavior is worse than any other thing that can occur. So when you have something such as lying and an affair, betrayal of any sort, right? Lying is or rather, trust is the foundation of any relationship. So typically a person gets into addictive behavior out of this intense desire to meet their needs. And we develop this compulsive behavior because often of our own wounds and deficits growing up. So we don't necessarily go, hey, you know what? I'm going to head into my relationships and I'm going to try and destroy them all by lying. Right? We head into relationships often thinking, man, if I get into this relationship and it goes well, the chances are I'll be able to quit my addiction. Or if I head into, when I have a kid, I will not act out in my addiction once I have a kid. Man, the start of this new year, right? The intent, the heart of somebody who's struggling with addiction is typically to get out of the trap that they feel like that they've been in. And so I want to make sure it's clear that as we struggle with the different issues we have in our lives, we usually revert to lying as a way of trying to protect the other person, protect ourselves, figure out how I can stay in the relationship long enough to get myself healthy. But it's obviously a very unhealthy, convoluted, ugly thing that we do. So over the course of a relationship, we develop this long history of lies, especially if we have an addiction. So when it comes to light that an addiction has occurred in the relationship or is occurring in the relationship, we have to find some way to say, okay, let's get to a baseline of honesty. Like, what are we up against here? What have I needed to know, whether you believe I should know it or not, so that we can get to a place of like baseline honesty and then progress from here. So I believe that if the relationship is going to continue, a disclosure is a must. Did that answer the question? You're on mute.
Yes, it answered the question. Yeah, and Dr. Rob did research about, particularly with sex addiction, and what he and his co-researchers found was um, that it's less about what you did and more about the lies and secrets.
Yeah,
That does more damage to the betrayed partner and more damage to the relationship. And until relationship trust can be restored, you're always going to be on shaky footing. And disclosure is kind of that first step in really restoring relationship trust. It's like, let's get to ground zero and be truthful from here on out.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Should you do therapeutic? And by the way, type your questions into the Q&A. We'll probably won't get to them today, but I'll save them and we'll do them in our next session. We may get to some today or we may not. So Matt, what should you do therapeutic disclosure if you're not interested in saving your relationship?
I love that question. And the answer is no. If you are not continuing forward in the relationship, if you're not working on reunifying, then I don't suggest doing a disclosure. Now, it's tough because you may have a betrayed partner who says, I need the disclosure in order to decide what I'm going to do. So if within their heart, the betrayed partner is saying, I truly want to figure out whether I can move forward or not. And so I want a disclosure so that I can make that choice. I think that's fair. That's needed. But if you're the one who has had the addiction and you don't intend to move forward in the relationship, I don't think it's helpful for a betrayed partner, and I don't think it's helpful for the person with the addiction. And I mean, I'd be interested if I'm sure that there are times where a betrayed partner says, well, it would be really helpful to know. Well, it might. However, it might not be helpful for both parties. And the other thing is, sometimes I've seen information shared with a betrayed partner and it's not helpful to know. It can cause a lot more damage and healing work for the betrayed partner, especially if you guys aren't going to be together anyway. So that's my quick answer on that one.
And sometimes it can be used as evidence in a divorce proceeding and child custody, things like that. So if you're not saving your relationship, be careful.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not going to stay in there, right? And it's tough because sometimes it may be used as evidence, and it's like the truth is it always in the best interest of children to deny custody, right? And it's hard because the court's trying to figure that out, therapists are trying to figure that out. Just because something can be used as evidence, should it be, right? I'm not going to be the one to answer that because we're talking hypothetical here, but so yeah, if you don't think the marriage is going to continue, I would say take the information you have, move on to get the healing you need with the information you have. You don't need information in order to heal.
Should my partner and I each have our own therapist as we go through therapeutic disclosure?
It is highly recommended you each have your own therapist, and there's different reasons why. I think just from the idea of like an advocacy perspective, like when I'm working with, let's say, somebody struggling with an addiction, I am trying to do everything I can to bring out all the relevant information. And one of the things that I'm actually looking for is, what are you ashamed of? We know that shame is one thing that fuels addiction. And so in the disclosure, I'm trying to figure out everything this person is ashamed of as part of the disclosure. So of course, they don't want to reveal some of this because they're embarrassed, they're ashamed. They think that it is evidence that they're a terrible person. And so or it's going to provide evidence to their spouse, which is external shame, that they're a terrible person, right? And so, but I'm trying to bring all of that out because I want them to honestly get to the end of the disclosure and realize, okay, I'm in a clean slate here, clean slate from the perspective of we're starting at that baseline, not clean slate as in, oh, yay, we just met and we don't have any baggage, right? That's hopefully nobody misinterprets what I'm trying to say there.
Yeah, whether I'm the betrayer or the person listening to the disclosure, I need my advocate and support there for me.
Well,
you know,
right, and
it's painful.
Absolutely. And so then we get even further into that when you get into the disclosure process itself, so you have the preparation for the disclosure, which, I'll just jump in here and throw it in there. I've had people that I've worked with that it has taken, I'm trying to think of the shortest time I've ever done a disclosure in. It's probably been 2 months, maybe a month, right? I don't particularly recall, but if somebody asked me, I'd like to do a disclosure, in my mind, I'm thinking a month, 2 months, 3 months, because I don't know what I'm working with, right? And I will tell both parties, or I will tell the person I'm working with, it is more important that we make sure that this thing is like full and ready to go than it is that we rush this. Now, there are times where there may be a really good therapeutic reason to rush a disclosure. But at the same time, for the most part, I'm going to say, let's make sure this is thorough, because you're going to do more damage by knowingly withholding on a disclosure than you would by waiting for the disclosure to be ready. Now, do we want to wait a year? Probably not, right? Like that's not going to feel good. There gets to be a point where it's like, well, let's work with what we have. Now, once the disclosure is prepared and happens, in the disclosure, both people are going to want a therapist typically for support, to help them ask questions, or to state things in a way that might be helpful, right? They're really there to say, hey, or I've been in a disclosure where I've had to ask, hey, are you still with me, right? Like, are you still here? Are you still present? Because I want you present for this disclosure. Or I've even said, hey, I want you to look at her. Don't just stare at the paper. I know this is hard, but do your best to look at her. I want you to see not only what this is like for her, but I want you to feel what this is like for you. I want you to have the experience. And so having your individual therapist there who has prepared you through the process, I think is very beneficial.
Thank you. You mentioned that we don't want to rush disclosure, but we don't want to wait too long. And I'll just add, one of the reasons that we don't want to rush it, and this is me speaking as an addict, is addicts are often so deep in denial that they can't remember everything all at once. Like it takes a while to dig it up and break through the denial and get them to be willing to admit the things that they really don't want to admit. And if you rush it, you end up with an incomplete disclosure, which is horrible, but waiting too long is also horrible. So is there a normal time frame?
Yeah, that's the hard part. Normal time frame. Well, I could say that I have a pretty normal time frame based on what I work with my clients, but I've seen it all over the board, and it depends on what work they've done prior to getting to me. A normal time frame, I would like to see it happen usually within 90 days of D-Day, if that makes sense, Discovery Day, right? But it depends. And so I feel sick about it if it goes longer than 6 months, because to me, it's like, oh my gosh, that's got to be excruciating for the betrayed partner. Now, sometimes the betrayed partner needs that time in order to get stabilized and healthy for themselves. So it's tough to pin down a specific time frame, because you're working with two individuals who very much can be in a pretty unstable place, and for a lot of good reason. So hopefully that answer helps, but I don't like how vague it is.
That's okay. And that's the proper, there is no exact answer. This is not an exact science, and every couple is different, and every person within every couple is different. And so there's always those factors. Steph Carnes says, disclosure is a process, not an event. And she talks about 3 sort of real specific stages: formal disclosure, impact letter, and emotional restitution letter. and these happen in order, but they don't happen boom, 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 like all in the same session. So can you talk a little bit about spreading it out, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about what is a formal disclosure, what is an impact letter, and what is an emotional restitution letter?
Yeah, and every therapist typically, I mean, for of all the therapists I've talked to about this, I mean, we like at our agency, we've kind of done our best to standardize it in a way that we feel works best. And obviously, you know, we've been trained in CSAT and the way that CSAT recommends it be done. And so we're all, but there's always little things that you're trying to figure out what are the needs of the couple and, you know, each individual, that sort of thing. And so the disclosure itself, like I said, you know, I've had people that, because of the acting out history, or because, right, like Scott was saying, the when you say the, you know, their memory isn't all there, because there's a lot of acting out, and acting out is very often about dissociating from reality. And so remembering what reality was and what actually happened can be a bit of a process itself. But disclosure itself can take, like I said, weeks to prepare. I've had times where I'm doing a session a week and then a couple of sessions in a week to try and finalize it and shore it all up and make sure that we've prepared it properly for that person. And then and I guess we can talk about this. Well, I'll throw it in here. In the course of preparing disclosure, we are also, like, if I'm working with somebody that's had the addiction and I'm helping them prepare disclosure, I'm reaching out, or the therapist for the betrayed partner is reaching out to me and saying, here's a list of the questions. Now, the betrayed partner's therapist is doing their best to help the betrayed partner figure out, what questions do you need to ask? Why do you need to ask this? Here's the potential dangers or trauma of asking this particular question. Sometimes there's information that's wanted that in any typical situation would be traumatic and actually not helpful. But like in my case, if I'm working with a betrayed partner, I still leave the power up to the betrayed partner to ask that question. And I will tell if I'm working with somebody struggling with the addiction, I'll say, hey, she's or he's asking this question, and I realize that this might be a tough one for you, or you may not feel like it's necessary, but I think it is necessary if you're going to build trust in the relationship, even if it causes your betrayed partner harm. And so let's just be open about what this question is and what it looks like. I don't know if I need to explain that or just keep going.
I think just keep going.
Okay, so then disclosure happens, and typically I will schedule a 2-hour session, and I will encourage the client, whether it's somebody with the addiction or a betrayed partner. I said, I want you to have your support system ready to go. So if we've scheduled it for 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., then I want your support system ready to go. Sometimes their support system is sitting in my lobby and they're just waiting, you know. Sometimes they're out in the parking lot. Sometimes they're at a restaurant just waiting for the person to show up. And I'll say, hey, if you need to, have somebody there to drive you away, right? There may be a lot of emotion or, you know, difficulty coming up for you. I want you to be prepared. And if you've got somebody waiting in the lobby to drive you somewhere, go for it. The person with the addiction, I will often encourage them to even let their partner know, I'm going to have a bag packed. I'm going to stay at so-and-so's home, or I'm going to be at this hotel. If you need me to, this is where I'm going to go, right? I'm not going to just go do it. I'm going to say, hey, I want you to know that I'm respectful, that you may need some space. You may need the home for yourself tonight. And so I've got a bag packed. I've got things that I need. And if I need to, I will, I have that as an option because I want to respect that for you. But have your support system ready to go, whether it's in the lobby, parking lot, ready to drive you away, at a certain location. I think that's actually pretty important. Then you come into the session And, every therapist is going to do this a little bit differently, but you ultimately do the disclosure. And at times, if I've got a betrayed partner who I can tell is dissociating a little bit, I'll say, hey, do you need a break? Do we need to go for a quick little walk? Do we need to talk about something? Or do you want to keep going? And they'll say, I want to keep going. Or they'll say, hey, I need a break. And so if they need a break, all right, depending, like, again, I will let the betrayed partner choose the location of the disclosure. So if the betrayed partner says, I want it in my therapist's office, we do it in their therapist's office. If they want it in a group room, we do it in the group room, right? Like if they want it in the other therapist's office, that's fine. I let them choose because I want them to choose their environment as best they can. And so if the betrayed partner says, I'd like him to step out for a moment or her to step out for a moment, then the person struggling with the addiction will, with their therapist, leave the room. So within this 2-hour window is what I typically do. We have this protocol in place to allow some breathing room, to allow questions to be asked, that sort of thing. I encourage the person who is doing the disclosure to pretty much go through the whole disclosure. And I'll often ask, if I'm working with a betrayed partner, I'll say, hey, you can stop and ask questions if you want, if you need to. I will often say, try to write your questions down as we go. And you can ask them to pause. Like, hey, can you pause, write a question? Okay, keep going. Try not to jump in, try not to interrupt, but if you need a data question, right? Like, wait, hold on, what year did you say that was in, right? You can ask that, feel free, right? So, but try not to, we want to try and let the disclosure happen in full, as long as we're staying present, writing as many questions as possible. And so get through the disclosure. Again, this is just how me and my associates tend to do it. This is how we think works best. And then once that disclosure happens, we'll ask, depending on the circumstance, the betrayed partner, do you want to ask some questions? Do you want to take a moment? What would you like to have happen? Oh, I'd like to take a moment. Okay, great. Well, would you like us to leave? We leave, whatever that looks like. And then they invite us back in and we come back in. And so we typically don't have them do any touching during no hand, no comforting. I'm reading the statement, we're facing each other. That's typically how we're doing it. Again, I'm like trying to figure out what details are most beneficial. I'm not trying to train you guys how to do it, but I want you to have some idea of how we do it and how this just typically looks for us.
So we've got a 2-hour session. I'm the addict. I come in, I read my prepared disclosure and try to make eye contact while I'm doing it. And there's a break if we need it. And then there's questions and
then we're answering the questions.
Right.
And ultimately, this usually will occur within this 2-hour process. And then that's disclosure. Okay. Then if you're going to do the impact letter, there's a reason why I wouldn't do an impact letter at disclosure. One, there's already a ton of information. I like it to have a betrayed partner to be able to write the impact letter. One, write the impact letter after you have the disclosure, if that makes sense. Start writing it before, write it after, because ultimately at some point you're going to read this impact letter to say, here's how you impacted me. Here's the effect it's had on me. And it's not to make them feel shame. It's not to make them feel guilt, right? It might make them feel shame. It might make them feel guilt. It's to allow yourself to be seen and heard, whether they can see or hear you or not. But that impact letter is going to be done at another time. Right? And it's up to the betrayed partner typically to decide when that would occur.
So it's another joint session, usually a week or two later, maybe longer if that's.
Yeah, it just depends on what the need is for the betrayed partner. It might take the betrayed partner a little while to write it and to really explore the impact.
And to process the disclosure, particularly if there was new information and,
Absolutely.
there may be some fresh impact that wasn't there before.
And I'll throw this out. Almost never is there not new information. And let me explain what I mean by that. It doesn't mean that everything hasn't been shared, but lots of times the way I typically encourage, if I'm working with preparing a disclosure, I typically encourage the disclosure to be prepared in a chronological order. And I will encourage them to, like, honestly, we're looking at it, obviously, because it's sex addiction, we're looking at a sexual history disclosure, really. And I will say, I don't care if your disclosure starts when you were 4 years old and you remember seeing your mom or dad coming out of the shower and you weren't ready for it or whatever. Like, let's talk about anything let's look at your whole history that for you may have impacted you sexually, right? Even if you can look back and go, well, that really wasn't sexual, but I remember at that time, nobody talked to me about it. I didn't quite know what to think. The body parts were different than mine, whatever it is. And it starts even that stage of curiosity that couldn't be talked about in the home for whatever reason. And so let's go from the earliest thing we can remember that may have had a sexual impact and go from that point forward. And so if you go through the disclosure that way, sometimes there's no new information given, but when it's been given chronologically, certain pieces fit together to where it feels like new information. Well, I knew that, but I didn't understand that happened here, and then this happened, and whoa, right? And so, but pretty much plan on getting new information, because you don't know how it's going to impact you. I think I was going to go somewhere else with that thought process as well, and now I'm trying to remember exactly where I was going to run. But why I say that, I think, is because you never know how much a disclosure will impact you. So then you move forward, you write the impact letter, and that you can determine when that's going to occur. I've seen some therapists do like an appreciation letter. I've seen them encourage that to be done at the end of disclosure. If the betrayed partner wants to do something like that, they can. I don't typically recommend it, because let's not talk about what we appreciate after a painful disclosure. I've seen it. Some people tell me it works really, really well. Betrayed partners may even actually want to, and that's okay. If you want to and you think that'd be good for you, go for it. But again, not typically encouraged, because I wouldn't want a betrayed partner to feel like they are required to.
Right. So we have the impact letter, the betrayed partner reads it to me, the addict, and what happens after that letter is read? Is there another period of Q&A? What do we do there?
Yeah, I mean, there could be Q&A. I would try and leave the impact letter where it's at. Meaning, if the betrayer has questions about the impact letter, I think that's okay. I would try not to use the impact session as, okay, the betrayed partner can now ask more questions about disclosure.
Right.
I would try and keep the impact letter its own unique experience, if that makes sense, even though it's part of it.
Yeah. And then do we again have outside support lined up for both parties if necessary?
Generally, if you're in a place to do the impact letter, you're in a place where you don't necessarily need support in the lobby, but you need to know yourself that if you think it's if the betrayer knows this is going to be awful and I don't do well, absolutely have support. You can never go wrong having support. Worst case, you say, hey, I'm actually doing really good. Let's go hit Starbucks. Worst case, you just have your friend there. I mean, I would almost encourage everybody to always ask for support. Have somebody ready to go.
Yeah, at the very least, have somebody on speed dial. Make sure somebody knows what you're doing and have them on speed dial.
Yep.
So then the next stage and kind of the third and final-ish stage of disclosure is what we call the emotional restitution letter. When does that happen and what does that cover?
You know, the emotional restitution letter, I was going to grab something on it because the emotional restitution letter, where is that? Oh, gosh.
This is a response from the betrayer to the betrayed after hearing the impact letter. And there are certain things that go into it. And I think that's what Matt's looking for here.
Yeah. So essentially, you're going to prepare this, and you're not, what you want to make sure is you wanting to validate, you're wanting to acknowledge deception. The emotional restitution, your biggest danger in the emotional restitution is that you just don't want to you don't want it to be about asking forgiveness, because that's not yours to ask, right? That the betrayed partner needs to figure out what that process looks like. But again, you have the emotional impact letter, and then your emotional restitution is going to be built on that to essentially acknowledge, I see you. I recognize the harm. I acknowledge how I've impacted you. I'm being accountable to that.
And here's how. Here's what I'm going to do.
Well, yeah, and it's basically, I'm acknowledging my impact, but you don't want it to be like, I'm going to prove to you, right? You don't want it to be this, my list of my good boy or good girl behaviors moving forward, and right, like it really just, it needs to be about that I see you, I see I impacted you, and I'm going to acknowledge what I've done, and even the things that I'm still learning, right? So again, that can't be done until it's sincere, and it can't be done until, and truthfully, it's modeling for the betrayer over time. Every time you see your impact, acknowledge it.
Yeah, this is the beginning of empathy, which is necessary for healing.
And sometimes when I'm dealing with somebody, oftentimes when I'm dealing with somebody who's struggled with addiction, they honestly often struggle to even do empathy. So I'm helping them write this letter, this statement, to teach them how to acknowledge and be empathetic. I mean, I joke around at times that it's this robotic experience, but it's robotic because when did they learn it? When did they have an opportunity to really grasp and understand and lean into empathy?
And he's not kidding. I've been through this process, and it is like, I have to think about it. It's like learning to walk. Okay, I'm going to pick my leg up a little bit and move it a little forward, and I'm going to that's how I had to learn empathy.
Well,
it was really hard.
Oh yeah, and people who experience addiction often feel like they're being accused for being, right, these awful people. So you say, hey, when you did this, on our third date, or when you did this on our honeymoon, or when you did, whatever it is, the person with the addiction typically is like, well, yeah, I did that, but, and they're trying to explain, like they're trying to, well, but this is what was going on. And they're trying to explain themselves, not realizing that they're draining any possibility for empathy, because they're in that defensive space trying to explain themselves. And so it is the most sometimes painful process to teach them, yes, I did do that. That must have really hurt you.
Yeah. And this is one of the reasons to slow down the process of disclosure, to do formal disclosure and then an impact letter and then an emotional restitution letter that's worked through with the therapist beforehand, because otherwise they're going to launch into defensiveness like right away, usually. So to slow it down and walk them through the process of empathy.
Sorry, say that again.
Slowing the whole disclosure process down, not doing this formal disclosure and impact and empathy letter on the same day.
Right.
Because the tendency is to get defensive really quick. And if there's time
Right.
to discuss it with the therapist, you can weed that out of the emotional restitution letter.
Well, and sometimes these things that are occurring are also about, like, we want to make this as authentic as possible, and we want to give the person as much of a skill set as possible, right? And so it's this balancing act of, what do we need to do to get you in a frame of mind to do this step? And now how do we get you in a place where you can do this step? And so that it's not robotic. Yeah, slowing it down is really important. And that balancing act of how do we slow it down enough that it's effective, but not slow it down so much that it causes more harm.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to skip my next question because we actually covered everything in it. So I'm going to go to the next one on my list. This is a question that addicts will ask. I'm worried my partner will be traumatized when I share my disclosure. Is there a way to avoid this? Is it okay to hold back the stuff that will truly hurt my partner and our relationship?
It is not okay to hold back the stuff that will truly hurt your partner, even if it ends your relationship. And the way that I try to encourage is, if you have any hope that your relationship can move forward, you have to get out of the mindset that you are protecting your partner. You are causing far more damage. It would be like you saying, look, if I lock my child in the basement, I will protect them from the harm of the world. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe. And you will cause more harm to your child, and we consider that child abuse. And so, your thought process may be well-intentioned, but it is more damaging and more harmful. If we have a truly healthy relationship, I will not manage my partner's emotions. I will actually let them manage their emotions, or ask me to show up for them when they're hurting, even if I'm the one that does harm. It goes both ways, and a lot of my betrayed partners hate it when I say what I'm about to say. I say that that your relationship is progressing in a really good way when you are able to provide vulnerability so much that you allow them to hurt you worse than they've ever hurt you before. And they're like, no, that's terrifying. And I said, of course it's terrifying. But is that not what you did on your wedding day? Is that not what you did when you committed into the relationship? Is that not what you did when you moved in together? Right? That where you said, I'm going to allow vulnerability that you can hurt me worse than anyone else. Now, part of the trust and strength and attachment in a relationship is, you can hurt me and you choose not to. You can hurt me, you did hurt me, and you choose to let me go through it and work through it with you. That's how attachment is built. So if you withhold, you aren't in a relationship, not in a peer-to-peer relationship, mind you. You're in a manufactured, somewhat of a fantasy relationship where you're not ever being truly vulnerable. So if your partner can't have you, if your partner won't have you at your worst with your full vulnerability, then you need to go somewhere else. I mean, that it sounds terrible, but you have to come forward. Now, when we get into disclosure, it's okay. You don't want to, the classic line that I tell people is, if a spouse says, hey, does this dress make me look fat? The answer is, well, I got to be honest. Yep, you're a fatty. Like, that's not honesty, right? If my spouse asks me, does this dress make me look fat? My response is, that's not my favorite dress that you've tried on. But I think you're beautiful. If you want to wear it, go for it. If it makes you feel good, love it. But no, what you're asking me is my opinion there. It's not my favorite dress. I don't think it's the most flattering, but if you love it, go for it, right? So again, I hope it's not too much of a sidetrack. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, but the
But
whole point of doing a disclosure is to get back to this honesty and vulnerability baseline that is what we all hope for and strive for in our intimate relationships.
it's in a sense what we agreed to when we got in the relationship, even if you didn't know how, even if you were struggling with an addiction and you've never had an honest relationship in your life, it's still the basis, the basic concept for any relationship, or at least for that intimate of a relationship.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a quick pause here. I see a hand up. Please type your questions into the Q&A or the chat feature. We'll get to them when we can. Most likely, I'm going to save them and bring them back in 2 weeks, and we'll continue this Q&A. I don't think we're going to have time to get to everything today, but we do want to answer everybody's questions because this is a hugely important topic. But raising the hands isn't going to work today. Sorry. Okay, so let's jump down the list. This is a partner question. After we've done therapeutic disclosure, we heard the disclosure, I got to ask my questions, I gave my impact letter, I heard the emotional restitution letter. Now it's a month later and I have another question, something I want to know about. How do I raise this issue? What's the proper way to go about, for me as a betrayed partner, to ask another question?
Yeah, and to be honest, in the lead up, in the build up to disclosure, we're talking about this, right? And because it goes along the same answer. If the question is, hey, if I remember something that's not on my disclosure, how do I go about disclosing it, right? So it's the same concept. If somebody who is a betrayer says, hey, I remembered something that needed to be on my disclosure, and it just popped into my head, and that can happen a week after, it can happen 10 years after, right? How do I go about answering that or sharing that? If I remember a question that I have, how do I go about asking? And so what I encourage both people to do is to, one, the easiest answer is take it to your therapist and discuss it with your therapist. So go to your therapist and say, hey, I remembered this thing, I remembered a question. Here's my question. And worst case, ask your therapist, how do I go about doing this, right? Well, it depends on the couple and where the couple's at. Sometimes I'll say, hey, do you feel comfortable taking that to your couples counselor and doing it together in front of your couples counselor? I would ask each other as a couple, hey, if this comes up, what do you need, right? Because if a betrayed partner says, hey, if you have something that comes up that you remembered that wasn't on your disclosure, and if the betrayed partner in a reasonably healthy and stable place says, I don't want you to share it with me if we're not in the presence of a therapist, but then when it happens, you say, oh man, I just had something come up that I totally forgot about, and they're like, well, tell me, what is it? And it's like, no, let's go to you requested we see a therapist, let's make sure to go to a therapist and talk about this, right? Or you go to your partner and say, hey, something came up, you requested we see a therapist, and so now I'm going to disclose it. So try to figure out what your needs are and then honor those needs, but you never hold it a secret. You never decide, you know what, I'm just not going to share that. That is not allowed, ever. What you do is you say, hey, I discovered something, I remembered something, and you could ask, would you like me to share this with you now, or would you like to do it in front of a therapist? Hopefully, after doing disclosure and preparing a disclosure, you have a good idea of like how much detail to share. And so you can share it. And if your partner has a question and you're a little bit like, well, I'm not sure if I should answer that, you can say, hey, that's a really good question. I'm going to take that question to my therapist, and then I'm going to come back to you. And I have an appointment in a week, and then I'll come back to you and we'll talk about it, right? It's okay to slow it down and say, I'd like to know your question, or I'd like to hear your disclosure, or let's talk to a therapist, and then work it out together but you want to ask the question, you want to disclose. And so what that process looks like often is very individualized depending on what your needs are.
Yeah.
That hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, and you answered like my question and the one I was going to ask after it about what if I remember something.
Right.
This is something I hear from partners. What if after therapeutic disclosure, I don't think the addict has disclosed everything, or I simply can't find a way to trust the addict again? What happens then? That's
well, no, it's a
Sorry.
great question. There's a couple of pieces. What if I
think you're holding back.
Yeah. Well, the reality of it is, you don't know. And everything about the trauma that's occurred to you is the biggest trauma is the deceit, is the lying. And so it would be totally and completely normal for you to feel that way. And the trouble is, how much bigger of a betrayal is it going to be if they truly are holding back? I mean, it's devastating. And so I try to encourage the person preparing disclosure. We want to make this as thorough as we can, and with an understanding that if something else comes up later, we have a plan for it. And so really, you're doing the therapeutic disclosure as a way of inviting your partner to tell you the truth, to give you a full disclosure, and to see it's not a test, but in a way, it's like, I want to see what you present. I want to see what you bring me. And it's tough to trust you, but if you truly don't bring me a full and proper disclosure to the best of your ability and you withhold, well, now you've used a therapeutic opportunity as another betrayal opportunity. Like, what an awful experience.
Yeah, you want to end your relationship, hold back on disclosure. just gonna throw that out there for the addicts.
and it's not a guaranteed end to the relationship. I've seen people work through it, but goodness me, like, you take an opportunity, a healing opportunity, and you use it as a weapon, you'd be better off saying, no, I'm not ready to do disclosure. I'm going to keep trying. It may take me a couple of years. You'd be better off telling the truth that you're not ready and you don't know when you're going to be ready, but that you're not willing to prepare an insufficient disclosure, right? And then at least let your partner sit with that misery, if that makes sense. But you're being honest, and then they have the right to choose, which is what they deserved from the beginning. They deserved the right to know from the beginning. They deserved the right to choose from the beginning. You did not have the ability you did not have the right to withhold that from them when they were committing themselves to you. It was not okay. So you withhold again, and oh my gosh, you're causing so much harm, potentially. Now, your reason not to trust is totally legitimate. Now, you may have to sit with, well, I have to just accept that this is their version of a full disclosure. And you don't want to, I wouldn't suggest challenging them and saying, I don't believe this is it, right? I would ask questions. Well, I'm confused. I had heard this information, and so I'm not sure how this lines up. Most likely you're sitting with some confusion. You may end up bringing more out just by asking the right questions, even though that's not your job. It's not somebody with the addiction or the betrayer might say, well, you didn't ask the right questions. And it's like, no, that's garbage. That's a garbage answer. It's not your job to ask the right questions in order to get the information. However, asking some questions might bring more information forward. So feel free to keep asking questions until you get the clarity you need. Did I fully answer that?
Yeah, I think so. And it's my follow-up is, can a polygraph help? I think I'm more a fan of the polygraph than you are, but
Well, actually, when I first started this process, I don't know that I was a huge polygraph fan. I'm at a place now where I would say almost universally, unless I have a betrayed partner who just says, I don't need it. Even then, still sometimes, depending on the case, I've actually told clients, hey, look, I want you to do the disclosure, and I'm not willing to work with you as a clinician unless I get a polygraph from you, right? I've had clients lie to me enough that I'm like, hey, I want a polygraph from you just so that I know I don't want to waste my time if you're not telling me the truth. And so I'm actually a pretty big fan of a polygraph. Here's the interesting thing about polygraphs, though. I had a situation where I had a client go to a polygrapher. And in this case, if you look at the polygrapher's reviews, there's a bunch of horrible Google reviews. And this polygrapher, even though my client had actually told the truth, this polygrapher was like, hey, you lied, and like basically extorted money from the person, and or will fix the polygraph, right? And so you want to ask, and that I think is such a rare situation. I only say it though because ask your clinician, who are the polygraphers that you recommend. Ask your clinician and other partners even, hey, which polygrapher did you do, right? It's like asking referrals for a therapist. Hey, which therapists were good for you guys? Which therapists do you trust? Which therapists were helpful, right? Just because somebody's taking a polygraph doesn't mean that the polygrapher is amazing. And so I would find somebody who's well respected, who therapists are recommending. And like I said, if they have a bunch of terrible Google reviews, that's a decent sign you should probably find a different one. So,
and if you're in or near a big city, you'll probably have options. If you're, tucked away in a tiny town in northern Canada, you probably don't have a lot of options for a polygraph.
and
So you got to take that into account too. Yeah.
And it's like everything else. You've got to trust. You've got to trust your clinician. You've got to trust your polygrapher. You've got to trust, you have to trust people. Nothing is perfect. And so a polygraph usually will provide a momentary relief of, okay, cool. I feel good knowing that my partner passed a polygraph, right? And it's a momentary relief, but it's not the end all be all that's going to create this lasting sense of comfort. But I think it is a helpful tool in the process.
And as an addict, I actually want to take the polygraph. I want to give my disclosure and take the polygraph and pass it so that we all know, okay, we are at this baseline, so now we can heal.
Right.
I'm serious about saving my relationship. I want the polygraph.
And most likely, when I have, here's my gracious assumption. Usually when I have a betrayer who doesn't want to take a polygraph, they're scared because they have a bunch of misunderstandings of what polygraphs actually are. Well, what happens if I'm telling the truth and they actually say I'm lying, right? Like, what happens if, and you know what? Great questions. Ask them to your polygrapher, because I guarantee you they've been asked that question before, and I'm pretty sure they have a process for that, right? Like, there's no way, if you're scared and worried that that's a possibility, that you're the first person they've ever encountered and they're going, that's a great question. I don't know why you're doing a polygraph, because you could tell the truth and it might be false, right? Like, if they're good at what they're doing, they're going to explain that. I'm sorry that I'm like, that was so cynical on my part, but like, I hope that makes sense. That they're going to walk you through to say, hey, great questions. Let's talk about this. Let me tell you about the measures that I'm taking, and what this typically looks like, right? Let me tell you what I do and why I do it and how we're safeguarding for these things. Well, most polygraphers at least that I've worked with, will tell you that the more questions you ask, the less scientifically accurate a polygraph is. So my favorite polygrapher will tell me I won't ask more than 3 questions on the polygraph. Now, that doesn't mean that in the process of doing the polygraphic interview, or whatever they call that, that they're not asking a bunch
of baseline. What's your name? Where do you live? All that stuff.
Yeah, they're asking you
about the disclosure.
They're asking you a ton of questions to actually, from what I understand, and I am not an expert on polygraphy, it's not what I do. Maybe I should bring one of my favorite polygraphers on here, see if he'll let me drag him on here and we can talk a little bit more about polygraphy. But polygraphy? Is that what it's anyway?
Polygamy? What?
it's or calligraphy anyway. But what they have told me is that they ask a bunch of questions like, what's your name? Where do you live? How many email addresses do you have? How many phones do you have? Right? They're asking you a bunch of really good questions. Have you acted out? All these different things. When's the last time you acted out? And they're using a ton of questions, which are usually revealed in the polygrapher's report. And then they typically have 1, 2, or 3 questions at the very end that the partner has usually worked with the polygrapher on to ask. And those 1 to 3 questions at the end are really your big questions, right? And if I remember right, and I'm, like I said, I'm not an expert on the polygraphy process, that like asking 1 question is like a 95% accuracy, 2 questions is 90, 3 questions is 85, something like that. And so they have a really good, right, percentage of accuracy, if you will. But again, it's not perfect. And I remember the first time I really got in and started asking my polygrapher questions, I'm like, okay, what if they're a sociopath? What if this? What if that? I'm asking, and he had really good answers that I don't have for you because I'm not an expert in that area. But he was basically like, honestly, here's where we are with polygraphy today, and here's how we can rule this and that out. Really good stuff. Most of the time, if not every time, when I have a betrayer going in to do it, they're like, look, I'm calm because I'm not worried about it. I'm going to spit anything and everything out. Now, the polygraph report, I have come back to the therapist of the betrayer. The therapist of the betrayer reviews it, discusses it with the therapist of the betrayed partner, and says, here's what's been disclosed. Here's the information. Basically, here's the information. They passed. And if there's any new information, because I have had it where I had a betrayer pass the polygraph, but had new information in there. And it's important for the therapist to make sure, is the new information that was revealed in the polygraph shared? Because they can pass the polygraph and it's like, well, they passed. And then the betrayed partner thinks, oh, they passed. Well, they passed because they shared extra information. Well, that extra information has to be shared to now keep the disclosure in full. I think it's a wonderful tool. It may be very confusing as I've tried to explain it, but I actually think it's a great tool, and I encourage it. Almost in every case at this point, I will say, do it. It's worth it.
Cool. I'm a big fan of it too. We're out of time today, everybody. Thank you for being here. We have some more questions. I'm going to copy them out of the Q&A and the chat feature, and I had a few more that we didn't get to today. So in 2 weeks, if it's okay with you, Matt, we'll take some more questions on disclosure.
Let's keep doing it.
If you think of questions, this is for everybody listening. If you think of questions that you want to get added to the list, you can email me anytime in the next 2 weeks, scott@seekingintegrity.com, SCOTT @seekingintegrity.com. Just email me your question. Say, hey, this is a question for Matt. I'll add it to our list. Matt, thank you so much.
Absolutely. If this takes us 3 weeks or whatever, let's do it. In fact, Scott, real quick, that would be the 9th.
I think so.
Okay, tell me your thoughts and maybe we can talk about this offline. I'm out of town on the 9th. I could do the 2nd, which would be next week. Probably I'd have to look, or the 16th, or we can just wait until the end of July, but that's a whole month away. Well, no, 2nd, yeah, it would be the end of July. So
let's email and we'll figure it out, and then I'll post it on our website for
okay, everybody stay tuned. I'd love to come back. I'm out of town on the 9th, but we will be back and we're going to keep going on this.
Cool. Thanks again, Matt. I'm going to leave this room open for a minute while I copy the Q&A in the chat feature, so we don't lose those. And we'll see you either in 1 week or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, depending on what Matt and I decide.
All right, guys. Hey, thanks again. You guys are amazing. Keep